This tutorial is for anyone experiencing trouble with color bleaching or fading when you're applying Mod Podge to your projects. I've received a lot of comments asking how I get my colors to pop, and I do a lot of balancing of colors with brightness and quality before I print, without going into too much detail on that. Even if you don't go to that length, there's still a way to make it so that your colors don't fade and that your paper doesn't shred when you're applying your Mod Podge to your project. So we're going to go over that in a little bit more detail so I can show you what I'm talking about. Please forgive the messy desk. You'll have to forgive me. I don't clean it very often. I tried, but I fail. One of the first things you're going to want to do, and this is something that I noticed early on, you'll notice that this is not your standard color for Georgia Pacific or your standard weight for printer paper. Normal printer paper is 20 weight, and I discovered early on in my projects that if I wanted to avoid paper fading and shredding, I needed to upgrade. 24 is a decent upgrade number. It's a good halfway point if you're experimenting, but I found that 28 weight is sturdy enough that it'll handle glue, and you notice it's thicker than regular paper, but it's not cardstock thickness. So it's still able to wrap corners, it's still able to be malleable when slightly wet from the Mod Podge or other sealant without shredding or causing the colors to fade unless you use an inordinate amount of glue. So that's the first thing you're going to want to look at, is whether or not you're using the paper appropriate to the amount of stress you're putting on your project. Another important thing that I've noticed is that larger brushes, for me at least, the larger the brush, the more tendency it's a sponge, so it's going to absorb the glue as you're using it. And the larger the brush you use, the more glue is going to be absorbed into it. When you're using a 1-inch brush like this, there's only so many little nooks and crannies the glue can go before it just won't hold anymore, which will allow you to have more control. I always make sure that I wipe it against the inside of the jar before I apply to my project anyway, to make sure that I get rid of any excess. And you want to make sure that it's just got enough glue to cover the surface. You don't want to overload your paper with glue, otherwise you're going to definitely experience that fading and that bleaching out of the colors that you're trying to avoid. Okay, so please, again, forgive the mess, and hopefully I can help make sense of this a little bit. You'll notice I'm starting off with Looking for Group. It is my favorite webcomic, bar none. I love Richard to pieces. I don't have the physical comic book, so of course I printed it on 28 weight paper to make sure that none of my graphics bleached out or faded. One thing I do want to mention, even though we're not going too deep into the printer specifications for, making sure your graphics come out right, because each printer is different. I can't give you explicit directions on how to avoid printing too light or too quickly. But what I do is, when I'm getting ready to print, I go into my printing preferences and I select to make it high resolution and to emphasize high printer quality over speed. And if you have the option for it, emphasize photo quality printing in your selection before hitting OK. And I would go ahead and save those options if this kind of printing is something you're going to be doing quite often. The first thing I want to do is you're going to get a clean 1-inch brush, and you're going to get a thin layer. You're going to take a thin layer, so about this much glue on the brush. And I'm starting off with a coaster. So you're gonna paint one thin layer of glue, and I'm using Mod Podge, over the section that you plan to put the piece of comic on, or whatever photo you're using. And if it doesn't stick, and it should, just don't feel afraid. Go ahead and put another thing on it, and just smooth it with your finger. I have, if I can find it, a little spreader that I got as part of the Mod Podge toolkit, and I can't emphasize enough how useful that is, because it's a rubber tool and it's like a scraper. You can also use a credit card if that's easier. I don't appear to have either one of those right now, and that's making me look a little bit silly, but if you have them, they're very useful. I would recommend them. I don't mind using my fingers, though. I'm not afraid to get my hands dirty, so I'm just going to stop looking. Except for a little quick peek under here. And no. So we're just going to carry on. Anyway. So you have that. And it doesn't take too long for this to dry. It really doesn't. Once you get that thin layer applied, it really doesn't take long for it to dry at all. Just let it sit for a few seconds, and then it's dry enough to put the top coat on. And that's just another thin layer. So once you have that done, you go like this with the brush, just very lightly, not too much, just enough to get it damp, tacky, make it tacky. And then, you can go on to different sections, put different pieces on while you're waiting for that section to dry so that you don't feel like you're wasting time or sitting immobile, pondering your navel, And just, while it's just little bits, not a whole lot, just enough to make it tacky. And then smooth it with your thumb or whatever scraper you're using. And then, just let it sit. And once you have the entire surface area covered like that, then you can add another thin coat over the top of it. So, for instance, you don't want to use too much because if you see right here where the light hits it, it's starting to bubble. And you want to avoid that. So you're just going to use real thin layers and smooth it out with your fingers or with a rubber scraper or an unused credit card that you no longer feel the need to use. Credit cards work really well to smooth this out. But I'm going to go ahead and switch to another project that's about ready for more top coats. This is another project that, like the coaster that I just showed you how to make, once I've finished doing the whole surface area like that, it'll look like this. This has actually had one more layer applied over the top of all of it, but not a lot, so it's still got quite a bit left to do. And what I do after that is I just start heaping on the sealant. Start putting a whole bunch on there. Mod Podge, whichever adhesive you're using. And, they say to use, enough to make it so that it's just white. I like to use thicker coats so that you can't actually see the graphic underneath, but I don't do that until it's got this, where you can tell that the image is protected. There's no sign of, paper feeling under here. It all feels like glue. So once it feels like that, that's when I feel comfortable to add the thicker coats. And you just paint it. You can use a larger brush for this stage if you like, because at this point your pictures underneath are protected. And you can use more glue without having to worry about saturating underneath. Once you have a couple of layers, you can use a whole bunch. And I have actually made coasters with really, and that's actually my signature, is I've got coasters with real thick sealant coats on them. And that allows me to have a cushion for the drink that I'm using. This one hasn't been completely sealed, so you're going to have drink rings, but, you can kind of see how thick it gets. That's probably not the best example. Let me find a better one. Here. And you can see the colors have not faded. And that's the method that I use and that I recommend. And if you have any questions, you can always ask.